Hi, everyone. Welcome to the 35th edition of this stay-at-home series. Today, why Marxism is not Eurocentric. So Bhaskar has other commitments today. He promised me that they're important, so today I'm standing in and hosting for him. As you know, Jacobin is doing this series every night, almost every weeknight at 6 p.m. Eastern, talking to left-wing thinkers for 30 minutes and then a Q&A. As always, we encourage people to take part by logging in and leaving comments in the YouTube chat. Remember that we're doing these for free, and our only ask of people is that you press like and subscribe so that we can trick the YouTube algorithm into reaching more people. Let me just tell you what's on store for the rest of the week. Tomorrow we have Daniel Bessner on what a socialist foreign policy would look like, what a working class foreign policy would look like in this world in which we live. We have Anton Jaeger on Thursday on the left populist moment in Europe and what happened to it. Then on Friday, we have Leah Ippy on Rawls's theory of justice and its relationship to socialism. And then as always on the weekends, there's Weekends with Anna Kasparian and Michael Brooks. This Saturday at 1 p.m., the guest is Glenn Greenwald. So today it brings me great pleasure to introduce Nivedita Majumdar. Nivedita is an associate professor of English at John Jay College. She's also secretary of the Professional Staff Congress, which is the faculty and staff union of CUNY. She's written many things about this and related topics. One thing that many of you will likely have seen is this chapter from the ABCs of Socialism book that Jacobin put out a few years ago, titled Is Socialism Just a Western Eurocentric Concept? She's written a couple of articles for Catalyst recently, Love, Labor, and Capital, as well as Silencing the Subaltern. And she has a book forthcoming from Verso titled The World in a Grain of Sand, Post-Colonial Literature and Radical Universalism, coming soon to bookshelves near you. Please remember to subscribe and like and leave questions, and we're going to pass them on to her. Nivedita will speak for around 25, 30 minutes, and then we're going to have a discussion. Thanks very much, Nivedita. Turn it over to you.
Thank you, Adana. And hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. You know, these are difficult times for so many reasons, but I guess a especially troubling one is because we cannot freely interact with each other. So it is really nice to be able to talk to you tonight through this forum. So we've been suddenly thrust right in the midst of an unprecedented crisis without any forewarning. And as with all crises, natural and human, it is the poor and the disempowered amongst us who are paying the highest price. All over the world at this moment, in Detroit, in Milan, in Tehran, in Madrid, in Istanbul, in Bangalore, wage workers are experiencing not just hunger and deprivation, but worse, a damning uncertainty of how long this period will stretch. Like many of you, I saw the images of multitudes of migrant workers in India walking hundreds of miles to their villages. These are workers that were barely eking out a living in cities. The more fortunate among them were maybe saving a little for the future, but they were all deadly poor. They had migrated from their homes in the villages because conditions in the country were much worse. Now imagine the level of pain and helplessness it takes to give up on that tiny bit of security that the cities offered them and walk hundreds of miles back to the very villages from where they came. An asthmatic domestic worker in Indonesia spoke of being very afraid of the virus, but went to work anyway because otherwise her kids would starve. Workers all over the world are forced to make a choice they are actually very familiar with between saving their lives and their livelihood. The crisis of corona is the crisis of capitalism. We may not be able to fully control viruses, but we do have the resources to take proper care of the sick and to ensure a dignified living to all during such periods. That it is not happening proves that it is primarily a manufactured crisis that flows directly from capital's foundational logic of privileging profit don't know if, where I was when we lost the video, but I was talking about how both capitalism and socialism function across national borders and borders of other categories of historical difference like race and gender. But while on the liberal left, there is a consensus on the permeability of capitalism across various divisions, there is no similar consensus on socialism. Even in the midst of a truly international crisis, there is no broad agreement that we need to turn towards socialism. So that is the part that I really want to focus on. Because many of you are interested in learning about socialism, and many of you are organizing for goals that are consistent with socialism, like universal healthcare. And you will, or you have come across a popular line of criticism against socialism, that it does not account for historical differences like that of race and nation, and instead offers a flattened response to what is a very socially stratified universe. It usually takes the form of questioning of universal programs that socialists advocate, like healthcare, like social security, free tuition, higher minimum wage, and so forth. Now, the criticism is that universal programs with their one-size-fits-all approach do not quite end up addressing disparities arising from historical inequities, especially of race. And a concrete instance of it would be that even in countries with universal healthcare, minorities sometimes fare a worse outcome. So I would like to discuss why this is a highly flawed line of criticism against universal programs. But first, I want to point out that this critical approach is grounded in a more academic critique that claims that the foundation of socialism, i.e. Marxism, is a Eurocentric discourse. And the charge of Eurocentrism accounts not just for the European origin of Marxist thought, but more pertinently to the view that Marxism is unable to address non-European social reality because it imposes a set of assumptions about culture and needs that are fine for describing the West, but somehow distort the reality of non-European cultures. Note that it is not the same as saying that non-Western countries have different cultures from the West. Socialists, of course, do not deny that. What the criticism of socialism amounts to is that cultural difference is so foundational and intrinsic that the way people in the non-West think about the world, about their needs, about their interests, is so radically different that European theories simply can't make sense of them. Now, the trouble with this criticism is that it is both historically and analytically false. Let's talk a little history first. From its inception, the Global South has been central to Marxist thought. After all, it is not surprising that a thought offering a systemic critique of injustice against working people and a vision of a just society would train its eye on parts of the world that are most impacted by injustice and suffering. The expansion of capital into Asia and Africa and the dominance of countries by imperial powers occupied a prominent place in Marx's own work. The trajectory of the communist movement remained internationalist from its inception. Questions of colonialism, multinational empires, the socialist condemnation of imperialism, and the right to national self-determination were central to both the first, but especially the Second International. Thinkers like Kautsky, Lenin, Trotsky, Mao, Luxemburg, Weber were preoccupied with questions of the limits of empire, the relationship of the laboring classes to the national bourgeoisies, the relationship of feudalism in the global South with capital, and the path for social liberation, socialist liberation. Building on this legacy, dependency theories and world systems theory developed the idea of the transfer of wealth from poor to wealthy states. Socialist thought inspired revolutionaries in Algeria fighting French colonialism, in the anti-apartheid movements in South Africa, in the Black Power movements in the Caribbean, and in popular movements across Latin America. If the very formation of the Soviet Union with its multi-ethnic constituencies necessitated urgent reflection on issues of culture and political autonomy, China and Mao's views on new democracy offered a version of socialism tailored to the realities of the non-Western world. The Chinese path, in turn, inspired communist movements in countries like Peru, Philippines, India, Nepal, Zimbabwe. Now, we may have legitimate issues and differences with many of these strains of Marxism, but even a cursory historical look reveals the absurdity of the proposition that Marxist or socialist thought does not engage with non-European contexts. The critique not only lacks historical grounding, it also fails analytically. Let us examine how this critique is applied in the context of our immediate struggles. People critical of socialist politics internationally also question that universal economic policies are particularly beneficial to people of color within the country. If socialist politics is foreign to the cultural reality of non-Western countries, the argument goes, it does not speak to the experience of US racial minorities. Many of you are familiar with this flow of the argument. It posits that because the oppression of racial minorities is based on race, economic policies do not make any fundamental difference. They argue that raising the minimum wage or free college or universal healthcare, they don't quite address racial inequality. Now let's probe the charge a little more. On the issue of free college, they contend that it does not address the fact of wage gap between Black and white graduates, or that higher minimum wage won't change the fact that Blacks will continue to have a harder time finding employment. Similarly, on universal healthcare, they point that in European countries with single-payer systems, aspects of healthcare delivery remains racialized. Now note the commonality in all these charges, that universal there is true premises flawed. So it is true, for instance, that Blacks have a harder time finding employment. But it is also the case that because Blacks constitute a larger share of the lower end of the labor market, raising the minimum wage to $15 would disproportionately benefit Black workers. So while 23% of all white workers will benefit from the raise, it will benefit 38% of all Black workers. Now take free college. The critics are right that even with a college degree, there is a gap between the earning of Black and white graduates. But here's what they are not telling you. The racial difference in earnings significantly decrease as we go up the educational level, and in fact vanish after a point. While Blacks with a high school diploma make only 62% of what whites in that educational bracket make, Blacks with a college degree make more than 90% of what college-educated whites make. So a college degree, in fact, goes a long way in addressing racial inequities. And if a college education narrows the income gap, then it stands to reason that we would want more minorities to finish college, right? But right now, only 22% of Blacks have a college degree as opposed to some 36% of whites. And clearly, the reason why there are fewer Black graduates is because a smaller percentage of the population can afford to think of college. So to the critics of free college, they need to appreciate how the policy would disproportionately benefit Blacks, and more importantly, would amount to a giant stride in the direction of addressing racial disparities. Now let's turn to healthcare. In his presidential debate with Bernie Sanders, Joe Biden cited the extent of the pandemic in Italy, a country with universal healthcare, in order to undermine the efficacy of such programs. That was Biden's point. Others have shown that Biden was wrong and have highlighted the pivotal work of the Italian health system in the crisis, and especially of the fact that hundreds of thousands served by the system will not be charged a penny. This is especially relevant in a scenario where the community is only as safe as its most vulnerable members. An aspect of the crisis in the US is the way it has highlighted stark racial disparities in the spread and the death toll of the disease. We are hearing that the impact of the virus on African American communities is vastly disproportionate compared to that on white communities. This is not surprising. Okay, so I was told that you might have lost me there. So I was comparing the stats in the UK and the US. And in the UK, while minorities constitute 15% of the population, the death toll has been 19%. While in the US, while Blacks, I'm not talking about all minorities because the focus has been on African Americans, while Blacks constitute 21% of the population, they account for 42% of all deaths. How are we doing with the reception? Okay. Now, it goes to show how even a weakened single-payer system like the NHS serves the vulnerable, including minorities, far better than a country without such programs. Remember, the critics say that with all the advantages of universal care, there will be discrimination. There will still be discrimination and on how they're implemented and so forth. Now, we don't deny that. And I want to be very clear about this. Socialists do not claim that universal programs will somehow wipe out racism or other forms of discrimination. But what these programs do is that they break the back of such discrimination. Of course, racism will still be alive with a broken back, but it will be a lot easier to kill. And this is something that we need to remember. So as an organizer, do not be distracted by the question of whether or not universal programs will end racial discrimination. Instead, ask that given that racism thrives on unequal resources, why would you not want to fight against the greatest barrier to racial equity, which is unequal access to services like healthcare and education? Ask also, what is the alternative to universal programs that will combat racism and other ills? Because no one-time payments or limited targeted approaches compare to the systemic transformation that universal programs bring in the lives of the poor and the working class. Universal programs erode the power of capital by decommodifying services like education and healthcare and are therefore consistent with socialist goals. So again, let's be clear, anti-racist politics that choose to deny the overwhelming benefits of universal programs to poor minorities is an anti-racism of the privileged. I teach at CUNY, a university with a working class student body that is constituted by over 3/4 with immigrants and minorities. Almost all my students work, many work full-time. They negotiate difficult family and work responsibilities while trying to earn a college degree. My students are as smart and as sensitive as they come, and they are at the receiving end of an oppressive social order every day. More than much of the US left, my students understand racism. But here's the funny thing. In the many discussions we have had, I do not remember a student less than excited about the possibility of universal healthcare or free college. They know that such programs won't spell the end of racism, but they also, at a gut level, understand what gives racism its power: unequal resources. So as you can see, a prominent section of the left, when it questions universal programs, excuse me, does not represent the needs and interests of working class communities from where my students come. And the reason for that is the US left is largely divorced from the very people it claims to represent. 4 decades of concerted attacks on the poor and the decimation of unions and working class power means that the left today has no real organizational grounding in working class communities. It thrives largely in elite college campuses and its satellite groups. Now, student activism has historically played a radical role, but that is usually in a milieu where it thrives in tandem with broader social movements. Things are hopefully starting to change, But until recently, the US left has been devoid of the lifeblood of movements and mass engagement. It is in a left like this, with little organic connection to the working class, that the question arises of whether socialism is too Western or too white. It is based on the absurd, and I want to say borderline racist, assumption that non-white people do not suffer in the same way from material deprivation as white people, and that they do not organize and fight back the same way. The pandemic has clearly brought to relief the ugliness of a capitalist world order. Ordinary people, vulnerable people, the world over at this moment are feeling powerless and afraid. More than the virus, they fear the lack of adequate healthcare if they or their loved ones fall ill. They do not know how long they can survive without going back to work. They are afraid because they do not know when they can work or if there will be any work at the end of it. This is a truly frightening predicament that at this remarkable moment unites working people all over the world. And let's be clear, it's a moment that has been produced by a virus far more potent and organized than Corona. It's the virus of capitalism. And if capitalism is universal, so is socialist resistance against it. It's time to firmly reject and move beyond the baseless notion that socialism does not speak for everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Nivedita. Thank you very much. Lots to chew over. Reminder, we're going to head to Q&A, but just a reminder, your obligatory reminder to press like and subscribe and leave some questions for us in the chat. Sorry for all of the technical difficulties, but I hope you can understand we're operating in Corona conditions. So Nivedita, I think I'm going to open with a question of my own that picks up on something that you said at the beginning and then towards the end.
Okay.
You made the argument that the crisis that we're living through illustrates the similarity of the predicament that poor and working class people face here, Italy, India, Iran, everywhere. But of course, there are some differences in the conditions that face people and the lives and societies that people inhabit in those places. You can think of first kind of cultural differences, which are sort of the differences that many of the people that you were berating in the academy kind of focus on. And then also, there are some material structural differences in the sense that those places tend to be poorer, or some places tend to be poorer than other places. Governments look a little different, movements look a little different. Could you help us think a little bit about how we should process both what is different and similar about these places? So first, maybe how should we think about these cultural differences that obviously exist, and then how also maybe we might think about these structural differences that exist? You did speak quite a bit about Marxists' attempt to think about these questions particularly of underdevelopment and structural differences.
Mm-hmm.
Say a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, sure. So, like I said, there is a lot in Marxist theory that dwells exactly into the question that you're raising, Adana. How does one deal with, uneven economic development? And what theories can we generate that address those kind of issues? But so let's see, should we do the similarity first? The primary thing here is to remember that capitalism everywhere, based on accumulation and based on profit maximization, functions with the same drive, right? And because it functions with the same drive, it produces stratification, inequality, human suffering, erosion of human dignity everywhere. So that's the first reality. The second reality is, and this is the universal part, the second reality is very remarkable. It's very simple and very remarkable that everywhere when people encounter the conditions generated by capitalism, they do not take to suffering easy. They rebel, they fight back. Many times, such resistance do not come to much, but the resistance exists, and the history of the left is rich with instances of organized resistance. So in uh, both of those aspects, in terms of what the basic drive of capitalism is, and how working classes the world over receive that, there is a remarkable universality. Now, you're absolutely right. How does, what does the left do with the differences? I think the left is doing what it needs to be done. Organizers everywhere, people on the ground know that experiences of oppression are filtered through culture. Culture is how we make sense of the world. So it is extremely important. And so organizing itself has to take into account that culture, has to speak to people in that language. I think that's crucial. And at a theoretical and many times at an instinctive level, people on the ground, people who are organizing, they understand this, and then theory can work on that and come up with larger categories which can explain those kind of differences. But I think for us the important thing is what is universal about all this.
Excellent. Thank you. We have a question from Miko about the DSA and the organized left, maybe more generally in the United States. Miko is asking, why is it that you think that despite the fact that socialism has these universalizing ambitions, why is it that the organized left in the United States has so much trouble expanding beyond the white, affluent, college-educated elite? Why is it that the USA doesn't look more like your students at CUNY?
Uh-huh. It's starting to. I think it's starting to. Yeah, and it's very heartening. I mean, I saw tremendous support for Bernie Sanders amongst my students, and I was surprised. But yeah, I mean, one would hope that would happen more. I mean, see, a lot of these questions, it's about the history of the country. It's about the level of organizing. Let's not forget, I mean, we are living in a country which has seen some 3 to 4 decades of unremitting attack on working people, which means that there haven't been, working class organizations that carry power like unions. There's been a decimation of unions. And because those things have happened, that's why you do not see the hold and the spread of those ideas as much as we would like to see. But I think the ground is starting to shift. I really do.
Another question is from Matthew. Matthew is asking, and I'm going to interpret this question a little bit. We think of socialism as you've been arguing, as a kind of international movement. But obviously, in the history of socialism, socialism has mainly been organized inside nation states. The parties and the trade unions that we've had have mainly, in large part, been organized around national concerns. Matthew is asking, how might the globalization of production how might this hinder or give opportunities to a global left and an internationalist left? What could maybe internationalist organizing look like for us in the United States today is another version of that question more specifically. But more generally, he's asking, how does the globalization of production change the character of the nationalist, internationalist thinking on the left?
Okay. So is the question, again, I guess we can't do a back and forth with the person who's asking the question, but I guess the question refers to the international division of labor. Adana, is that what
or the way that I'm interpreting it is just more generally, what could internationalism look like for the left today in the world that we look in? In your introduction in your talk, you very convincingly argued that we're living through similar things on many different sides of
Mhm.
many different borders. But what does concretely internationalism look like? So much of our organizing is nationally bound. But
True,
is there anything interesting that we could try and do internationally? That's the way that I interpret.
true. I look. I think I know that this is a question that that becomes very fraught on the left, and this was a question that sort of haunted Bernie's candidacy as well. One of the things that um, he's been criticized from the far left because of some of his nationalistic tendencies, which I would agree that they are questionable. I would say, however, that you know organizing work, this kind of working class organizing, is has to be local, and it is the fostering of working class consciousness creates solidarity. So we organize, and then through that we create solidarities across race, and through that you develop a broader vision. I don't want to go into a more sort of I probably have some ideas about how we can reach out to working classes in other countries, but some of it can only be at a symbolic level at this point. So if there is if there are certain struggles that by their very nature call for that kind of international solidarity, then that's a strategic question. So so that can be answered there in that way. But bottom line, I do feel that these kind of solidarities, both across race, across nation, has to be fostered through struggle. So I think you know let's not get too wrapped up in that. I mean, and but I do want to honor the spirit of the question. As socialists, I think like they said, think global and act local. But our global has always been international. It will always be international. So that goes without saying. And then how it pans out will depend on a specific situation, a scenario, a specific issue, strategy. So it'll vary. So yeah.
Excellent, thanks. So another question from the chat is about the generational evolution of socialism, not in the United States as we've been discussing it, because as you've discussed it already, the left, the academic left today in the United States seems dominated by people who charge that Marxism is Eurocentrism, the kind of Pomo world. But one of the questions is actually about the evolution of the left in India, as in particular, or more, we can think about it more generally in the world, but India might be a great place to start. So the question is how, even perhaps today, the campus left in India thinks that Marxist socialism is Eurocentric and outdated. Can you respond a little bit to that charge? The argument, I think, the argument that the questioner wants you to respond to is the idea that socialism doesn't really fit India. It maybe had its heyday a generation or so ago, but now where is it? It's dying.
So the question is why socialism isn't doing so well in countries like India.
Yeah, if
It is so international, then why isn't
exactly, if
it
it fits
doing
the
so?
reality so well, and maybe it was doing well in the 60s, but now it's nowhere to be seen. Something.
Yeah, but socialism isn't doing so well in the West either. So there's your there is your answer. The reason it is it's not thriving as much at this point is the same reason it is not thriving as much in the West, because capitalism has been very successful in its sort of global onslaught everywhere. But there is tremendous organizing going on, and I should also say that the idea of Marxism being Western, I mean, I lived in India till into my mid 20s. I went to university there. It was never a thing. Nobody, it would have been a laughable idea. So nobody ever imagined Marxism to be something of the West. You can disagree with Marxism. There's definitely disagreement. There were critiques, but not because it was something that was Western. And I've said this before. The only quarter from where this criticism came that it needs to be rejected because it's Western is the right. It is only from the right wing that that kind of criticism comes. So it was never an issue. The questioning was ideological. It wasn't of place of origin.
Yeah, yeah. Another question, and this relates again to, this is a question about socialism's weakness. I wish these could all be questions about socialism's strength. But one of these questions is about someone who has lived in Europe and Asia, but never in the United States, and finds it bizarre that the US in particular seems so allergic to socialism, and wants to know, where does that come from? Where do you think that allergy to socialism in the United States comes from? I mean, this is a more general question, maybe about American exceptionalism, but
yeah.
what do you think?
I mean, well, first of all, I want to commiserate with the person who's asking the question. I felt the same way for the longest time. I came into the country in the mid 90s and I was shocked by how marginalized the left was. Where does it come from? It's the US. It's the US of A. It's with its history of Cold War, its history of completely eviscerating everything that is left. That's where it comes from. It's the complete, shouldn't say complete, but it's a spectacular success of the right. That's where it comes from. But to repeat myself, I think that moment is changing. It is shifting. I think what we have seen with tremendous organizing that's going on everywhere with Bernie Sanders' candidacy, things are really moving in a different direction.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the other questions that I have just seen in the chat is about a distinction that maybe is worth making, and I wonder what you think about it, which is a distinction between Marx's own Eurocentrism or alleged Eurocentrism and Marxism's Eurocentrism. Because sometimes when I think you see people make the argument that Marxism is Eurocentric, they will, as evidence, look at certain things that the early Marx or the earlier Marx wrote about India and imperialism in India. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that. What, if anything, do you make of racism or Eurocentrism in Marx, and how does that relate to how we should think about Marxism more generally?
This is again something about which a lot has been written, and I don't know that we can go very much in depth within a few minutes about Marx's own thought about it. I never felt that it was racist in that sense. It was a particular understanding of economic development, and he might have been mistaken about it, but racism suggests something else. So I don't think that, and it's the same thing with a lot of Marxist thinkers. One can take issue with with their ideas and with whether or not they actually address non-Western realities. But to impute racism to something which you may not agree with, I don't think the two are the same. I think we need to be very careful about this. And again, like in my talk, I said it is a thought that more than any other thought, any other modern or obviously pre-modern thought that has emerged from the West and that has so seriously and so meticulously engaged with the non-West. And that's on the one hand with theorists. On the other hand, it has inspired so many anti-colonial movements, right? Thinkers, movements that, to me, these questions seem very academic. I mean, I'll just leave it at that because, yeah.
And to be clear, these questions seem very academic is a capital slur, right? One of the points that you made during your talk that I think it might be worth expanding on, which I found very insightful, was the analysis of racism and its relationship to resources and the unequal distribution of resources. I think sometimes the temptation in left circles and also academic circles in trying to understand racism or even any other form of oppression is to identify the salience and reproduction of racism with the incentives that racist people have to be racist the towards minorities, or the incentives that oppressors have to oppress the oppressed. And in fact, I think what your formulation captures is that very frequently it's not really about whether someone has the incentives to be
Mhm.
oppressing the oppressed. It's actually about capacities. And in fact, you
Mhm.
can have extremely racist white people, but if black people have the capacities to stand up to those black people, then racism will wither and die. Could you say a little bit more about how the argument about resources relates to that kind of?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Um, I think you captured it very well, Adana. So when we say that, even in a society with very robust, strong, universal programs, um, will racism die? No, it won't, because racists are not going to just vanish overnight or over the years, for that matter. So they'll remain, and some of them will be in powerful positions, so they will have that incentive. But so what? The point is, I mean, as long as minorities have equal access and they're gaining as much institutionally from these programs, then racists lose their power. It's a question of power. It's not a question of what's in your mind. You can be as racist as you want, but if you do not have the power to implement that, then who cares? So it then, just because racism will still remain an issue, but it will be an issue of attitude, and that's much easier to fight than giving that person with that attitude institutional power. And since that goes away, it's a much easier fight.
Precisely. Yeah, I think that's really well put. Is so another question, and maybe we might finish on this question unless there are other questions that come up in the chat, is what are the, and this is a version of a question that has been asked before, but I hope it's a good sign that people are asking about the prospects for revival of socialist and Marxist politics over and over again on chat. So what are the prospects in your view? I mean, you said that they're looking better, but can you say anything more about the prospects for a revival of Marxist politics and working class institutions more broadly, not just inside academia, and maybe not just in the institutions that already exist, but what do you think the prospects are for a revival of our kinds of politics more broadly? Where do you see hope?
Um, well, I see hope in the fact that, in like less than 5 years, in the span of less than 5 years, it blows my mind that in surveys, young people have said they prefer socialism over capitalism. I see hope there. In the US, I mean, how did that happen? I mean, socialism was simply, it had beyond any shred of doubt, it had a terribly negative connotation. How does that happen that within a few years that changes so much? And the reason, and Sanders's candidacy obviously has a lot to do that, but the reason he was able to be successful, tremendously successful, and to me, his candidacy has been, I do not see failure at all. I see tremendous success there. Um, is because he's capturing a, a growing despair, anger amongst people that comes after decades of attack. And young people have only been on the receiving end, right? I mean, people who are in their 20s, 30s, their parents still saw some of the benefits of an economic boom. But the younger generation has seen none of that. And they have only seen failure. And also they have not seen any much of the benefits of capitalism, nor have they lived through the Cold War years. So it does not resonate. The uh, uh, painting communism and socialism with those kind of broad brushstrokes doesn't have any resonance with the younger generation. So I think that all of that is making a difference. And the as a socialist, we are all wary, correctly, to how far electoral politics can go, and I get that. But what Sanders' candidacy, I think, has shown is that, in the long run, maybe it has to be a two-pronged battle. On the one hand, it has to be electoral. On the other hand, it has to be organizational. And that, to me, that is the largely, I see hope there, because there are organizations springing up, working class organizations. I see in my own union, I see in other unions, that the conversation is changing much more in terms of ground level organizing. So, these are all signs of something that could be very, very different.
Thanks very much, Nivedita. I think that's as good a note as any to end on, a note of hope. How about that in these times? So just a reminder about what's to come for the rest of the week. Tomorrow we have Daniel Bessner talking about socialist foreign policy. Then on Thursday, Anton Jaeger talking about left populism. And on Friday, Leah Yippie talking about Rawls and socialism. Reminder, we rely on you to like, subscribe, push our video to the masses. We really, really appreciate your support. Just a small ask. And hope to see all of you tomorrow at 6 p.m. for Daniel Bessner. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.